medicine and literature has been to be able to meet people who are medics, people who are professors of surgery, as well as professors of French. But also, as well as the academic side of things, I also found my closest friends in Oxford. I know Oxford can seem like a daunting place to go, but I've had a really wonderful experience here. So my own research, which I'm doing my PhD on, looks at the history of medicine in Renaissance France. So that basically means that I spend my time looking at lots of strange bodies and trying to understand the very strange ways in which people in the 16th century understood those bodies and how they wrote about them in both medical tracts, so that might be a kind of medical textbook for students, or it might be a kind of theoretical text, but also literary texts. So I look a lot at different types of fictional narrative. So what we'll be focusing on today is one surgeon in particular who had a kind of enormous influence over the history of surgery in France and in Europe more generally. So what I thought we'd start with is a game of, can we guess which surgical instrument these are? So all the images you're about to see have been taken from medical text written by our mystery surgeon. And using Slido, I'd like you to vote on the multiple choice questions for what you think is the most likely use of the instrument. So Richard, if you want to show the first one. So this is the first one. You can see there's different elements to this instrument. If you head on to Slido now, what do you think is the most likely use of this instrument? And then Richard, if we get any results coming through, you can send us.
For extracting blood, Rachel.
Not quite. I think you can see that might be some sort of needle, but instead of being used to extract something, actually, you can see that the needle is attached to some thread, and they're pieces of cloth, which you can see in that kind of zigzag pattern, which was in order to help the surgeons to be able to know exactly where they were meant to be sewing. So this is basically suturing, which we still do in medicine a lot today. But this was the 16th century version of suturing. And a fun fact is that instead of using thread, they would often use pig's stomach or cat's hair, because that was meant to be a particularly strong material in which to suture with. Okay, so for the next instrument, if Richard, you want to go along? Yeah, so that's the example of, it's a very famous picture from this writer's work of being sutured just along the face, and you can see that the cloth has kind of come together in order to guide the surgeon as they suture. Okay, so the next photo of the instrument, please. Here we go. So this is a very strange looking instrument. To give you a bit of a clue, I would say it's about 1 meter long. So it's not like a tiny needle like we saw before. It is much longer than that. If you already know a little bit of French, there's also a clue in the writing underneath it. So do we have any guesses? Any guesses at all?
Not yet.
This is a strange one. I'll give you just a couple more seconds. Okay, so Richard, if you want to go on to the picture. So this was an instrument that was used in order to put joints that had been dislocated back into place. So on the previous slide, where the French said was that something about a way in which a shoulder, so that was épaule, shoulder, can be kind of yanked back into place. Réduire l'épaule, so that's kind of reduce the shoulder back into its normal position. Is that this was a kind of a multiple man job, and that lots of surgery in this time was not very precise or careful as we might think of surgery as a practice now, but actually was a bit more kind of hurly-burly. Okay, so the final instrument is this one. Maybe slightly easier, but I want you to think about what it might be used for.
To remove bullets from wounds.
Yes, absolutely right. Well done. That's exactly what it was used for. So they're not quite scissors, which they might have looked like on a first glance, but they're in fact, yes, exactly, more like tongs, which can be used to kind of pluck something out. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so Richard, if you want to go on to the next slide. Oh, that might show us a photo actually. Yeah, there we go. So there they are, like little pliers, just using used in order to kind of pluck little bits of bullet or armory out of limbs. And this is actually quite a big clue because as to who the identity of our surgeon is, because medicine on the battlefield was a really important, the battlefield became an important space where medical development happened. So Richard, if you want to go on to the next slide. Is very introduced Ambroise Paré. So he is the surgeon that we're going to be talking about today. There's a lovely dashing photo, a picture of him on the side there. So he was born in 1510 and lived till 1590, and he was apprenticed as a barber. So he started off his career as this kind of a lowly barber surgeon. So unusual as that might sound for us today, training with a barber was actually the most common career route into surgery in the Renaissance period. Medicine was taught in Latin in universities, of course, whereas surgery was deemed to be not very prestigious. It was too kind of hands-on and too practical. And it was felt that you didn't really need a proper university learning or proper theoretical knowledge about the body in order to be good at it. So Paré is a very significant figure because he went a long way to changing this very deep-seated perception of surgery. And he did that through the innovative work that he did on the battlefield after he became a military surgeon in 1536. So the work that he did there, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail in this talk, gained him so much respect that he eventually became the personal royal surgeon for Henri II and 3 other kings. And he published a game-changing treaty about surgery in 1575. So before we go and have a look into Ambroise Paré's work in more detail, I thought that it would be worth contextualizing the culture of Renaissance medicine in which he worked. So if we move on to the next slide now, Richard. The question I want to ask is, what do you think of when you hear the word Renaissance? So you might have come across this term in your English classes, you might have come across it in your history classes, and I've given a few pictures on the board there, which might give you some clues. So yeah, if you want to put any words you can think of into the Slido, and Richard can read some out as they come in. So I'll just give a couple of minutes just to think about that.
Brilliant. We've got to start. We've got Shakespeare and Leonardo da Vinci.
Yes, fantastic. So Shakespeare is, of course, that figure in the top left corner. That is Shakespeare. He's probably one of the most famous in Renaissance. He's famous because of the plays that he wrote. So I'm sure you'll have studied those in GCSE English. And he had the kind of massive cultural importance and enduring importance. He's still studied today. He's still kind of remarked upon today as one of the great writers. And then yes, Leonardo da Vinci is the drawer of the images on the very top right. So he was, of course, an Italian painter. He was interested in how we can draw the body more precisely. So you can see on that sketch of the man that it's all about perspective, it's all about proportion, it's all about creating a kind of more realistic version of the body. So do we have any other words, or I can explain a little bit more? Okay, great. So yeah, so there are two big figureheads of the Renaissance, and what they really...
Vesalius.
Vesalius. Yes, yeah. So he's a very important medical figure, and we'll be getting to him actually in the next section of the talk. But that's great that we're already familiar with who Vesalius is. Fantastic. So these figures are really emblems of the way in which the Renaissance was this really exciting and thriving period of discovery. And that's what the actual word translates into, right? Renaissance, rebirth. So this period of time was sparked off by the unearthing of old texts from ancient civilizations. So by that I mean ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And these include the kind of big guns of philosophy that we might be familiar with already, such as Plato or Aristotle. And when I say the unearthing of old texts, this often was a very physical unearthing, as in old texts were discovered, buried in the basements of monasteries, and suddenly came to light and received a kind of new audience of readership. So these texts had been kind of largely unread in the Middle Ages, which is the period just before the Renaissance, probably from, say, 900 to 1400. And this period of time is often termed by people in the Renaissance as the Dark Ages. So it's a time where people regressed and they didn't really engage with big cultural ideas and big questions. The Renaissance then was a movement to kind of bring these ideas back to the forefront. And people in the Renaissance kind of particularly felt that the classical period had been this time of extraordinary learning, extraordinary erudition, and they wanted to bring those ideas and those kind of commitments to learning back to the forefront of people's minds. So you might have heard the term Renaissance man before. And this was an idea that someone who was learned, so someone who'd been educated, should be adept at all sorts of different subjects. So at literature, languages, medicine, philosophy, natural philosophy, which is what we might nowadays call science. And that all of this learning taught them how to live in the present in a more fulfilling way. So this big upheaval of ideas had pretty dramatic consequences across European society. So when we think of the period of the Renaissance, during this time the Reformation happened, which was the splitting of the Catholic and the Protestant Church. During this time was what we call the discovery of the New World, which was when trips were led out to what we now know as America and elsewhere to find different civilizations. So there was a sense that people in Europe expanded their boundaries, expanded their imagination of what the world was and what different cultures looked like and how they related to their own. And there was also big changes in medicine and how the body was understood. So if we go to the next slide, please now, Richard. So medicine in the Renaissance was also typified by this going back to how classical writers had thought about the body and thought about medicine. So the two big classical writers that were unearthed in this period were Hippocrates, who lived in ancient Greece, and Galen, who lived in ancient Rome. You may have heard Hippocrates before referred to as the father of modern medicine. And he's famous because he didn't kind of turn to the gods to help with an ailing body like his contemporaries might have done, but rather he believed in a very careful observation of the body, and that to treat people effectively, we must first try to understand how the body worked. So this was his bet, basically. He put forward the theory of 4 different humours that all needed to be balanced in the body in order to maintain health. So those humours are blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Not very nice. Not very nice to think of that swimming around your body. And this is where we might have heard bloodletting as something that happened in the past to do with medicine. And this is where this idea came from, that basically these 4 humours needed to be in balance. And when someone was ill, it meant that there was an overrepresentation of one. And so it needed to be purged. And that would allow the body to go back into balance and restore its health. So some of these ideas from Hippocrates have stood the test of time. So medical students today still take what's called the Hippocratic oath in the first year of case, they will not do intentional harm to their patient. And some of these ideas, even if they don't last today, lasted a really long time. So Galen in Rome totally picked up the idea of the humours, and they allowed him to lead to major breakthroughs in anatomy and the inner workings of the body. Galen did something that Hippocrates never did, which was that he started to dissect animals. And some people, there's a bit of controversy whether he did that or not, to gain a better understanding of how these humours might work. For example, he discovered that the arteries might carry blood. So if we go to the next slide, please. So in the Renaissance, medicine was what we call humoral medicine. So it was completely founded on the ideas that the humours were what constituted body. But practices of anatomy and dissection became much more important as the period of the Renaissance continued. So when we mentioned Vesalius, he's a really great example of that. In the Renaissance, there was just beginning to be a sense of tension between how much we believed what the classical writers said and how much we could learn for ourselves through kind of practice, trial and error, through our own experience. So anatomy and dissection is a really great example, because what would happen generally is that a Renaissance physician might have read Galen and thought he knows everything about the body, and then he might then in his classroom dissect and see that something doesn't quite match up. And his instinctive be, I'm ignoring in front of me and we're going to go with Galen's explanation. But Vesalius was one of the first physicians, Vesalius was one of the first physicians who decided that actually we need to think a bit more about what's going on here. And he put forward and put into the foreground an idea that your practice and your experience is actually really crucial and really important for how you understand the body. Other major inventions in the Renaissance medicine was the invention of the printing press. So this allowed for text distributed much more easily. So before the printing press, texts were only made in manuscript form. This means they were kind of handwritten by scribes, which was a long process and a very expensive process. But as the printing press was invented, it meant that society became much more literate. So ideas could circulate much more widely and to a much broader audience. So by the end of the period of Renaissance, we see that there are even kind of surgical texts being written in French for an everyday surgeon. Medicine was all about being taught in Latin in universities. As the printing press kind of gained traction, this started to change as well. And just one final point, I've listed there some of the different sorts of medical figures and practitioners who were important. Apothecaries, physicians, surgeons, midwives, charlatans, wise women. It was a very kind of crowded marketplace of different practitioners. Some of those had more authority and were more trusted than others, like a physician or a surgeon. Some were thought to have really a lot of knowledge based on their own experience, even if they weren't kind of taught in university. So that might be your midwife. But some were kind of total quack figures who were just kind of exploiting people's interests in medicine and trying to get by. I think in this we have kind of different questions around how we trust different doctors, how we trust medical developments. We'll have seen over this COVID pandemic that when the vaccine came out, this was a huge topic of discussion in the world about how much we can trust different things and the question of medical misinformation. So those things which were preoccupying the early moderns are still really important for us today. So if we go on to the next slide now, Richard, that's given us a little bit of background around the kind of landscape that Ambroise Paré was working in. So what I wanted us to have a little look at now is a very famous passage of his works, which describes probably the most important innovation that Paré was able to achieve in his career. So I mentioned that he worked on the battlefield. This passage comes from a particular night where, as we'll see, lots of things started going wrong, and it forced him to kind of use his intuition and try out something new. So I'll read it out for us. I've translated it into English here so we can all definitely understand it. Now, at that time, I was very inexperienced because I had not yet seen the treatment of wounds made by the arquebuse. The arquebuse is a type of a kind of new type of weapon. It is true that I had read in the first book of Jean de Vigo, so that's a physician, about wounds in general, chapter 8, that wounds made by firearms are poisoned because of the powder, and for their cure, he commands that they be cauterized with oil of elderberry, to which a little treacle should be added. So cauterized is the burning of the flesh. If you cauter the flesh, you burn the flesh. Not to fail in the use of this burning oil, and knowing that such treatment could be extremely painful for the wounded, I wanted to know before I used it how the other students carried out the first dressing. This they did by applying the said oil as nearly boiling as possible to the wounds using tents and setons. So I plucked up the courage to do likewise. At last I ran out of oil and was constrained to apply a digestive made of egg yolk, oil of roses and turpentine. That night I could not sleep easily, thinking that by the default in cautery I would find the wounded to whom I failed to apply the said oil dead of poisoning, and this made me get up at first light to visit them. Beyond my hopes, I found those on whom I had put digestive dressing feeling little pain from their wounds, which were not swollen or inflamed, and having spent quite a restful night. But the others, to whom the said oil had been applied, I found fevered with great pain and swelling around their wounds. From then on, I resolved never again so cruelly to burn poor men wounded with arquebuse shot. So, really interesting passage. I'll just give us a couple of seconds just to reflect on this a little bit. So Paré basically is describing that he was on the battlefield, faced with this really difficult situation, and he improvised and was able to kind of make some accidental progress. Something funny about scientific discoveries is that quite often there's an element of the accidental about them. That's something just tried by. Should we go on to the next? I have written for us a couple of questions. Yeah, here we go. So the first question, and then what I thought is we could write any answers in Slido. And I just want to emphasize here, there's no kind of silly or too basic answers, not at all. I'm just really interested to hear your thoughts and we can talk about them together. So what are the different types of learning on display in each passage? So perhaps if we go back onto the passage so you can have a read while we're thinking about this. What are the different types of learning on display? So by types of learning, what I mean is what are different ways in which Paré knows what he's doing and makes a decision about what he's doing? So again, Richard, if you want to read out anything that comes your way. Okay, so do we have any ideas?
Experience and chance.
Yes, excellent. So experience and chance. So perhaps if let's walk through the passage together and we can think. Observation, excellent, thank you, Richard. We can think about where these different things are occurring. So at the beginning, he's saying, yeah, I'm really inexperienced. I don't really know what I'm doing. That's the impression he's giving us at the minute. And he actually, the first thing he mentions that he had read in this first book of Jean de Vigo about wounds in general. So there we have our first example of a type of learning, which is book learning or learning theory. But as you're all absolutely right, where the passage really kicks off is where he kind of sets aside this book learning and uses his own instincts and his own experience to see what he should try and do. So he talks about how I wanted to know before I used it how the other surgeons carried out the first dressing. So he's kind of observing his fellow surgeons doing their work, and he's learning from that and carrying out that same work himself. That's what's going on in the first paragraph. As we move on to the second paragraph, then this is where chance comes in, right? And trial and error comes in. So he ran out of oil, and that forced him into making a new digestive, which is just a kind of word in the Renaissance as a kind of mixture or a recipe. And so he decided through his experience that maybe this could work. And then I think what's really important about this passage is that towards the end, he says, I resolved never again so cruelly to burn poor men with wounded arquebus shot. So he not only kind of did something by chance and did something by trial and error, but he learned from it and kind of decided to put that into practice from then on. So we've kind of got experience, observation, chance is kind of trumping ultimately this theoretical knowledge, which should be the most respected in this time. Excellent. So Richard, if you want to go and have a look at the second question. What is the importance of Paris writing in everyday French instead of Latin? So a little bit of context to this. I mentioned before that most texts to do with medicine are written in Latin. Paris was part of a group of figures, a group of surgeons and physicians who decided that they were going to make a shift and actually write in French. And what we call that is writing the vernacular, which means writing in an everyday language that everyday people were using and everybody could understand. So, reflecting on that a little bit, what is the importance of Paris writing in French instead of Latin? Why might he have decided to do that? Again, I'll give you a couple of minutes to have a think.
I'll have a go, Rachel. Becoming more accessible. Becoming more, to use a totally anachronistic word, democratic.
Yes, exactly. You're completely right, Richard. So basically, Paris strongly felt that surgery should be kind of respected on a similar level to medicine. And that the only way in which that could happen is if people took seriously the fact that surgeons needed to understand what they were doing. So they weren't just barbers who went straight from the hairdressers to the surgery, to a surgical theatre, or doing things in the back, and just kind of hacking away and hoping for the best. Paris felt that actually we needed to have some sort of regularization of surgeons, and it was important that they really understood the theory behind what they were doing. So he felt that in order to do that, we needed to meet surgeons where they were at, and so we needed to speak their language, quite literally, and write in everyday French. So what that meant is then that the understanding of the body and of medicine was suddenly more accessible to a wider audience who were literate but couldn't read Latin, but they could still read French. Excellent, thanks, Richard. And the final question, just to close off the talk I have, is how does Paris relate to his patients? So we can go back perhaps onto the passage just to have a look. And the context of this is nowadays we think of the doctors or physicians who might treat us in the hospital as being really compassionate, as part of their role is this kind of bedside manner, is they're helping us through a difficult experience. But in the Renaissance, this was slightly more confused, this idea. So we had Hippocrates saying, okay, you should not do any intentional harm to your patients, but there was not very many strict rules about how a patient should behave. So thinking about that, how does Paré relate to his patients? And perhaps to add on to that, how does the way in which he relates to his patients change his practice?
Sympathy for their pain.
Yes, exactly. There's a real sense of compassion and a real sense of sympathy. And clearly the other surgeons he's working with aren't really feeling that, because they're just pouring hot oil on their patients left and right. But Paré, exactly in that second paragraph, he kind of talks about the men being so cruelly burnt. He talks about not being able to sleep because he was so worried about his patients. There's a real, what we now might think of as a kind of modern drive here, for him to have sympathy and compassion for his patients.
Getting up at first light.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. He's dedicated. He's dedicated to his craft. He's dedicated to helping his patients feel better. Great. So I think with that, I'm going to bring the talk to a close. This is another passage in case we had lots of time left, but I think actually we're looking good time-wise. So yeah, now I'm going to open the floor. If there's any questions that you have, this can be questions about the Renaissance, about medicine, about what sort of work you might do in the Renaissance as an undergraduate, or they can be questions more broadly about my experience at university, about what Richard was talking about, anything you like.
Just one from me, Rachel, if you don't mind. Why barbers? Why have they been thinking of barbers? With all due respect to the immense skill that goes into barbering, why barbers?
So, I think the logic behind barbers was that barbers knew how to use the sorts of tools that it's not too big a leap to go into surgery. So they could use scissors, they could use knives, they could use, they had this practical skill. Something interesting about the Renaissance is different skills. Our life now is quite kind of boundaried. People stay in their craft. You learn a particular craft and you stay in it. The Renaissance was a much more kind of blurry period than that. So people could kind of shift between different disciplines, different areas. And so there was a sense that barbers had this very practical skill. They could use their hands well. They knew how to deal with different body parts. And so it wasn't a kind of too big cognitive leap to then go into surgery.
Very welcome to ask any questions on the Q&A tab. And we've got one in. Who do you think contributed the most to the progress of Renaissance medicine?
Oh, that's $1 million question. I think Ambroise Paré certainly contributed the most to surgery. I think he really was kind of the first very innovative surgeon who lived in France. And in medicine, so there a big figure, for example, in British and English medicine is Harvey, who basically worked out that blood was circulating around the body instead of just being kind of mixed in with everything like the humoral system. I think what's interesting is there are these certain figures and these certain realizations or inventions or innovations which are turning points in the history of medicine. But it's also useful to think of this as a kind of real period of gradual progress. So all these figures were kind of standing on the shoulders of people who'd come before them. And scientific progress and scientific change generally happens very, very slowly. It happens over a long period where people are in conversation, people are sharing ideas, people are very slowly kind of trying out new things, slowly pushing at the boundaries of what they know, pushing at the authority of classical physicians. So really, yes, there are these kind of big figures, but it's useful to think of them as in a kind of continuum.
And just one from me, it's actually about your own sort of background and interest, Rachel. Perhaps to conclude, unless there's another question comes through. You're in Paris as part of your PhD. You have, let's say, evolved to, really studying in depth the material you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
A brief sense of overview of how you got to looking at this sort of material from, say, when you went into your first degree. How did that journey happen? Yeah,
that's an excellent question. And I think there are all sorts of kind of different academic trajectories that people can have. So mine was in my undergraduate in Bristol. I was lucky enough to do lots of different modules on different aspects of French and French culture. So I did some work on the history of art, I did some on history, I did some on literature. And I kind of slowly realised, whilst I was kind of looking at lots of different texts, lots of different paintings, lots of different films, that something that I was interested in was the body and how the body is represented. So when I was in my second year as an undergraduate, I did a project about World War I soldiers being amputated on the battlefield. I can't really remember how I got there, but I think I'd seen some pictures, some photographs in a book of amputees with their prosthetic limbs. And at the time I was examining a period of art history called Cubism, where bodies were often being made in order to look quite like machines. They were being chopped up and made more kind of mechanical. And I was literally just interested by that contrast of a kind of artistic machine man and then a real machine man who was made a machine by the prosthesis. And from there, really, I then started to kind of follow through on this interest in bodies, in medicine, in how bodies are configured and how we understand bodies in different times. And I started alongside this work in kind of the First World War, being interested in the Renaissance work that I did. And kind of very, very slowly and steadily from there, I ended up shifting completely to the early modern period, the Renaissance period, and focusing on early modern medicine. So something about me is I also have a very medical family. My mum was a nurse, my sister's a doctor. So medicine is quite present in my life around the dining table. So that was something I kind of carried in from that. But I think all this to say really is that there are just, I think for a lot of people, it's something very small that just piques their interest. They make some sort of comparison, they notice something interesting, and it's the very, very small seeds from that you just steadily build it up to a PhD or a big project.
Okay, so to go to one really specific question on Slido and to add to my own, the question on Slido was which undergraduate degree did you take? But my own is, I infer from what you said, not wanting to put words in your mouth, but I think you more or less implied it, that you probably could never have guessed that, even with a family background, say in year 12, never have guessed that you'd be doing what you're doing now in terms of academic research.
Yeah, absolutely not, really not. And I think that's something that's so exciting about being at university and being in your undergraduate time, is that there's just so much there's so much freedom, there's so much flexibility. You're kind of a total blank slate when you walk in on your first day, and there's lots and lots of interesting things to learn about that can take you in any direction. And that's something that's fantastic. That creativity, that space to be creative, is such a joy of being a student. And yeah, so I did just French Sol was my undergraduate degree. That's quite unusual, just to do one language. A lot of people choose to do two, or they choose to do a language with history or with English or with philosophy. Especially in Oxford, there's kind of lots of scope for mixing and matching what degree you did. But I liked doing French Sol because it gave me the opportunity to cover lots and lots of different aspects of French culture. So as I said before, history, literature, history of art. Which is what I really liked, that variety. And then my research master's was what we call an MPhil, and it's just 1 year project where you write a 25,000 word thesis, which sounds a lot, but it's quite doable in a year, on a topic of your choice. So again, you have loads and loads of freedom. It's like doing a miniature PhD, just for a year. And then, yeah.
Rachel, thank you so much. You really put so much passion in this evening and really given us an insight and fascinating learning journey, which kind of square in the circle from what I was saying earlier, just how this learning journey has been sort of individual to you, and it's gone in a particular path, I suppose, much like supercurricular engagement. Rachel, thank you very much. It's been a relatively cosy session in terms of attendance tonight, you might say, but we have been recording it as well, and people will be also having a look at this after the event as well. So thank you so much. Thanks to those who've joined us, and looking forward to the next session of Trinity Talks in a fortnight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.